Support for Swan Song is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. Hey viewers, if you're sensitive to flashing lights, I would probably skip this episode because retro fighting games have a lot of those, and Pocket Fighter is no exception. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the video. In the late 90s, when Capcom was at their best, putting out banger fighting games left and right, they wanted to make a cutesy fanservice game for fans of their series. That game was Pocket Fighter, also known by its international name, Super Gem Fighter Mini Mix, and on April 6, 2000, a port of the game developed by Soft Machine and published by Bandai was released onto the Bandai WonderSwan. Soft Machine is a subcontractor game studio started back in 1989 by the programmer of Sega's arcade game Pengo, Nakakuma Akira. I've been struggling to find any information about them at all, so I can't say much more than that, but I recently became aware of their involvement in the development of 3 other WonderSwan games previously covered on the series. Last Stand from episode 25, Shinseiki Evangelion Shito Ikuse from episode 33, and Final Lap 2000 from episode 84. Most of their output consisted of pachinko, casino, and golf games for the Famicom and Super Famicom during that era, and at the very least, their WonderSwan output seems pretty damn good for a company with that background. They will be involved in a few more games later in the series, so look out for them. As you no doubt know, Capcom was directly responsible for the birth of the modern fighting game genre with the release of Street Fighter II in 1991. Throughout much of the 90s, Street Fighter II was seeing regular refinements through a seemingly never-ending stream of updated versions, ultimately culminating in Super Street Fighter II X, also known as Super Turbo internationally. By the mid-90s, Capcom was ready to move on from Street Fighter II and decided to branch out and develop multiple fighting game series in parallel, exploring distinct gameplay systems and art styles. In July 1994, the Vampire series, known internationally as Darkstalkers, established a lot of the conventions that would define the anime fighter subgenre for decades onward. In June of 1995, the Street Fighter Zero series, known internationally as Street Fighter Alpha, would serve as a prequel to Street Fighter II's story, and its mechanics primarily revolved around making basic combos easier while also raising the skill ceiling by introducing other systems to enable absolutely bonkers combo routes. In December of 1996, Warzard, known internationally as Red Earth, combined the fighting game genre with light RPG systems. By playing the single-player mode, you could level up a character and unlock new moves which would carry with you in subsequent play sessions with the use of a password system. At any time, you could be challenged by other human players making use of their progression character. In February of 1997, the Street Fighter III series would essentially serve as a soft reboot of the Street Fighter series, with a cast of almost entirely new characters. And while more mechanically conservative than the Street Fighter Zero series when it comes to combos, the infamous parry mechanic would completely rewrite the rules of defensive play from what they were in Street Fighter II. Not only is that 4 new fighting game series released in 4 years, but most of these were also seeing near-yearly revisions as the others were being developed. And I'm only mentioning the games here that are directly relevant to Pocket Fighter. There are also a bucket load of Marvel collaboration games being released in the background as this happens, and the SNK vs. Capcom games are also brewing in the background at the tail end of this. It's easy to see that Capcom was at the top of the world, cranking out innovative and genre-defining fighting games on the regular. While all of this was happening, a tile-matching puzzle game was released on the CPS2 arcade board, Super Puzzle Fighter 2X. In this game, each player is given a playwell, much like Tetris and Puyo Puyo, and must place gems of the same color adjacently to form the longest chains as possible. Every once in a while, the game would give you a crash gem, which could be dropped onto a chain of that color to clear that chain and turn them in for points. Pocket Fighter is what happens when you take the puzzle game based on fighting games and decide to turn it back into a fighting game. Gems of different colors feature predominantly as a game mechanic in Pocket Fighter. Some of the art is ripped directly from Puzzle Fighter, with the rest of it drawn to match that style. And characters from all those aforementioned fighting game series, including some of the World Warriors from SF2, make up the full roster of the game. In Pocket Fighter, hitting enemies with special moves can cause gems to come flying out of them. These gems are in 3 different colors, or in this case, shapes, each corresponding to a special meter at the bottom of the screen. Gems can be collected by either player, though generally it's going to be easiest for the attacker to collect them. Collecting gems raises that move's meter, and when the meter is full, that special move levels up. These special meters are preserved from round to round, so it's entirely possible that by the time the final round begins, both players have fully maxed out special moves. In the original Pocket Fighter and its console ports, each special meter is labeled with the corresponding special move input. I played Pocket Fighter with some coworkers less familiar with fighting games at a previous job and found that this label was a good way to remind players where the inputs for their most powerful moves were in the middle of gameplay. Unfortunately, the WonderSwan UI doesn't have these annotations, so you're left to looking up the special move inputs outside of gameplay, and you kind of have to intuit which move corresponds to which meter through trial and error. This reminds me a lot of the early game in MOBAs, where members of each team fight off waves of creeps to collect experience and gold to invest into their character's skills. And much like in MOBAs, there is a bit of a snowball effect here. Strengthening your special moves will make it easier to get more gems, which in turn makes it easier to strengthen your special moves even closer to the cap. And ultimately, you can keep collecting gems even after your meters are full, denying the enemy of resources that they could use to stage a comeback. Now, in other fighting games, the super meter is typically used as a comeback mechanic, as players who tend to get hit gain meter much faster than the player on the offensive. In Pocket Fighter, that super meter gain is embarrassingly low, and it doesn't feel effective as a comeback mechanic at all. Notably, while the other releases of Pocket Fighter feature items which can randomly drop from the sky and essentially serve as limited time weapons which can be used to power up against an enemy, this feature was cut from the WonderSwan version. Pocket Fighter for WonderSwan introduces 2 new novel game modes absent from other releases, so let's quickly delve into each of them. Point Battle is essentially just arcade mode but with an alternate scoring system that incentivizes finishing off your opponents as quickly as possible. It's essentially a time attack mode, but instead of expressing your time as a timestamp, your score is a total of your remaining timer at the end of a round. Card Battle, on the other hand, is kind of fascinating. In Card Battle, you have a deck of a bunch of cards consisting of gems, heals, evades, normal moves, and special moves, and you can stack these cards into combos based on various combo rules. Each card has a priority value, and if the card represents an attack, it has a damage value as well. Each player presents their stack, and the priority values are cumulated. Whichever player has the biggest priority value gets to have their combo play out, unless the opponent uses an evasion card, which always beats out any priority value. More cards can be unlocked by completing playthroughs of other game modes or through another feature I'll get to in a sec. Now, the fighting game history buffs in the audience may be thinking this sounds a lot like one of the scrapped concepts for Street Fighter IV. In a Eurogamer interview at EGX 2019, SF4 producer Ono Yoshinori said that the original intent was to make Street Fighter IV a turn-based simulation game instead, saying, quote, "You would take the moves you want to do and put them together like blocks and they'd run automatically." This would have been done to lower the barrier of entry to fighting games and eliminate execution requirements from the game altogether. I think that in retrospect, knowing how big SF4 became, we can be thankful that this idea was scrapped, and ultimately, alternative control schemes like modern and dynamic as found in Street Fighter VI is a much better on-ramp to new players while keeping the soul of the genre intact. But you can see the core of this idea brewing as far back as 2000 within Pocket Fighter for WonderSwan, and it is a neat peek into what that timeline could have been. Pocket Fighter supports the WonderGate accessory, which allowed the WonderSwan to be connected to a Mapura-capable NTT Docomo mobile phone to enable online functionality in certain games. This allowed players to submit scores for arcade mode and point battle mode to a global leaderboard and see how they stacked up against the competition. There were also time-limited downloadable cards available for the card battle mode to incentivize people to check in regularly. One of the things that stood out as being wild to me is that the game's training mode, sound test, and command lists were all distributed as downloadable content. Interestingly enough, thanks to the hard work of the people over at the cutting room floor, we now know that all of these features were actually baked into the game ROM and can be accessed with memory manipulation. While gamers love to hate on the idea of on-disc DLC, there's certainly an advantage to it in earlier online-enabled titles like this one, because it does mean that features and content that would likely be lost media today can easily be patched back into the game. Originally, I had found some information which misled me into thinking that Card Battle was playable online, and this would have been a really creative way to enable an online fighting game of sorts, given the constraints of mobile networks at the time. Hell, you could argue that most Japanese-developed fighting games haven't had functional online play since the advent of 2020's Guilty Gear Strive, demonstrating that rollback netcode is legit to the rest of their peers. Unfortunately, I found many contradicting reports on this, and Card Battle was only ever playable over a local link cable. In recent years, fans of Capcom fighting games have been crying out for the development of a Capcom All-Stars fighting game of sorts, a game where notable characters from throughout Capcom's history could duke it out against each other. Capcom tried this in the past with 2004's Capcom Fighting Jam, but that game was in development hell and scrapped together with assets from a previous attempt at the same concept, leading to a pretty mediocre and some would even say cursed result. But everyone seems to forget about Pocket Fighter, which features characters from the exact same roster of games and is overall a much more satisfying experience than Fighting Jam ever was. Perhaps it's harder to take it seriously because of its chibi aesthetic, but even though there are questionable flaws in the system's design and balancing, every time I come back to Pocket Fighter, I tell myself I should be playing this more regularly. I get heat every time I say a WonderSwan port isn't worth playing over the original version of the game, but I feel like it's especially warranted for a fighting game port like this one. Aside from the card battle mode, which is an interesting historical artifact in Capcom fighting game history, there is nothing especially novel about the WonderSwan port of Pocket Fighter that should push you to play it over the original arcade version. Crucially, if this was a wholly original game instead of a port, or if there was meatier single-player content to enjoy, I think it would be easier to recommend. Hate it or love it, the fighting game genre is best experienced by playing against friends or strangers around your skill level, and Pocket Fighter for WonderSwan just isn't a good way to experience what the genre brings, no matter how solid the porting job is.